Welcome to the Mindfulness Academy Podcast. I'm your host, Amy Morgan, and today we have on our show the one and the only Fleet Maull. Fleet, thanks so much for being on this show.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me, Amy.
Well, I'm going to start by introducing you. And I have been playing you up, talking you up to loads of folks because I've been so excited for you to be on the show today. So without further ado, Fleet Maull, PhD, is an author, meditation teacher, and entrepreneur who developed neurosomatic mindfulness, also known as NSM, a deeply embodied neuroscience and trauma-informed approach to meditation, offering an accelerated path to healing, awakening, and integration. He is both a Zen Roshi and a senior teacher in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. He founded Heart Mind Institute, an education platform for embodiment and resilience training courses and summits. He also founded Prison Mindfulness Institute, Center for Mindfulness and Public Safety, and National Prison Hospice Association, catalyzing two national movements while serving a 14-year sentence from 1985 to 1999. Dr. Maull is the author of Radical Responsibility: How to Move Beyond Blame, Fearlessly Live Your Highest Purpose, and Become an Unstoppable Force for Good. Quite the resume, and you have given so much. So we will hop in and talk a little bit about who you are, how we met, what the connection is for you being here on the show. And I think the first time we actually met, although I'd heard about you plenty before from the beloved Robert Olemiller here in Indianapolis, we met, was it a Center for Mindfulness and Public Safety? Was it a training call, something along those lines?
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a weekly call we do for public safety professionals in Indiana.
It's a beautiful service, and I encourage anyone listening, if you are in frontline sort of work, particularly with public safety, please look into that. See if you if that might be a good fit for you to hop on those calls. I think they're Wednesday evenings typically. It's quite.
I think. Don't get me wrong. I think they're at 8:00.
Yeah, they're really, really lovely. So I am wondering if you would tell us a little bit about yourself. And I would love for you to take us back just a little before what I think is more of a public knowledge about who you are, but take us back just a little bit farther into where you grew up. Where were you originally from, Fleet?
Mm-hmm. I grew up in the Midwest, grew up in St. Louis, actually, and a middle-class Roman Catholic family, a good family, family that had a small business. Growing up, I don't know if people are old enough to remember shows like, you'd have to be as old as I am, but if you remember old sitcom shows like Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, that kind of working class, suburban kind of, that was kind of the genre world I grew up in a little bit. Good family, good values, but we did have alcoholism in our family. And my beloved mother suffered from alcoholism, and it was kind of an episodic thing. Like, so most of the time she was this wonderful human being, wonderful mother. She was an incredible artist, but sometimes once a week, sometimes twice a week. You almost always at least once a week, she would start drinking and just become a different person. It was really a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. And, you'd get home from school, you could tell mom had been drinking, and she'd become this really scary rageaholic. And by the time dinner happened, it would just be chaos and fighting and screaming. And, my father didn't really know how to handle it. And then, eventually she'd pass out. And then you'd come down to breakfast in the morning, there'd be mom smiling, making breakfast, and nobody would ever talk about it like it never happened. So you can imagine the kind of psychic splitting that creates for people. And also, my brother was quite a bit old. I was the second in the family, but my brother was almost 6 years older. And so he was off to school at some point. And this didn't surface right away in my life. It surfaced, I don't know when it surfaced exactly, but around the time I started going to school or something. But at any rate, at some point, sometimes if my father was, away on business or out at a business appointment or something, and my brother wasn't there, which he was mostly gone by this time, she would come after me, right? And actually when I was about 12. I think somewhere around that age, maybe 10 and 11, 12. One time I walked into a room and I threatened her. I said, "You ever touch me again, I'm going to kill you." And I felt really bad about doing that, but I did it. And so she never touched me again. And but it's just that creates. So I don't talk about this to belittle my mother in any way. She was a wonderful human being, and she got her suffering for growing up as a very intelligent, artistic woman in a culture that really was very oppressive for women, and so forth. So, but at any rate, for me, it resulted in me arriving in adolescence with a big hole in my gut. And I graduated from high school in 1968, which is a very tumultuous year in U.S. history with all the assassinations, the Kent State killings. There'd been, what then were called race riots. Today, maybe after Black Lives Matter, they'd be called, I can't remember what the term, they'd be not rebellion, but another term, it's like protest or something. But anyway, the cities were burning. And where I grew up in St. Louis, it's been happening every summer since 65, 65, 66, 67. And a very tumultuous, in 68, Martin Luther King was assassinated and Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And just a very divisive, tumultuous time in U.S. history. And so I was angry, alienated, and and then I just went headlong into the counterculture of that time, as an angry young man with a big hole in my gut, and wanting to fill that with anything I could to ease the pain, right? So that took me right into a lot of substance abuse and addiction, and so, but I'd always been a spiritual seeker at the same time, and I had remembered my early childhood, which was perhaps before the alcoholism showed up. I don't know. Remembered my early childhood as being quite magical and feeling things were vivid, and I felt really plugged into reality, and at some point that just went away, and it was like gray tones, and I never made peace with that. So I was always looking for that, and of course, I was thinking I was plugging back in, with the drug, sex, and rock and roll, and to an extent there was something there, but it's somewhat real, somewhat mirage-like, and if you have a big hole and you've got a propensity to addiction, it's got a lot of baggage that comes with it, right? So at any rate, I was just looking, but I started exploring Eastern religions very early on. I figured by the time I was in high school, my sophomore year of high school was when I first smoked pot. I first took LSD, and I figured I was a Zen Buddhist. I figured all that out when I was 16 at sophomore in high school.
It was a big year for
and
you.
it kind of progressed from there. But growing up in Missouri, there weren't a lot of other people interested in Eastern philosophy, Eastern religions, or in that area. It wasn't like growing up in California or something. And so, it took me a while to find my way. Eventually, I left the country. I was just fed up.
Where'd you go?
About 1972, when Richard Nixon was reelected, I just kind of had enough, and I just couldn't. I was just so alienated, and so it was one thing, I wanted to leave the U.S., but I also was still looking for something real. And I'd gotten this notion that somehow I would find it in Peru. I don't know where I even had that image, and it wasn't about anything to do with drugs or anything to do with that. It was just something. And so anyway, I took off traveling and back as a hippie backpacker, and all the way down through Mexico. I ended up getting a local sailing boat, living on a sailboat for a year off in the Caribbean, off the coast of Belize, and then sold that, continued on down, and finally did make my way to Peru, and I really did discover, it was a very incredibly magical place. It was, just environmentally, it was incredibly powerful and magical. And, there was drugs were still part of the journey, but they're more in the background. It was really interested in the indigenous cultures and in the archaeology and but I did eventually fall into small time drug smuggling as a way to continue to live outside the culture. I had some connections down there. I would meet people coming down to, and then, I'd make a little money. Initially, I'd like make $1,000. I could live off that for 6 months down there. I was living, $1 a day kind of lifestyle down there, and but eventually it grew into something more than that. But I wasn't like I was trying to get rich. It was just a way to continue to live outside the mainstream of society. I justified it with all this us versus them thinking and feeling like, society was completely hypocritical and all that. And but eventually I heard about the founding of then Naropa Institute, later Naropa University, by a Tibetan meditation master named Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche in 1974. I was living way up in a very remote part of the Andes Mountains in Peru when some travelers brought a copy of Rolling Stone magazine that had a big feature story about the first summer session there at Naropa. And I just zeroed in on that. I got to go there. And I actually already zeroed in on the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. That's what I was studying. There had only been 4 or 5 books published. I mean, there's just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds now, but back then there had only been 4 or 5 books published, and I had them with me there in Peru and some other things. And I was trying to learn to meditate on my own, and and I knew that was kind of my lineage. I'd connected with it, just felt this heart connection to it. So I read about him, and I knew I had to get there. So eventually I did enroll in Naropa, and I did a very intensive 3-year clinical training program in Buddhist and Western psychology and psychotherapy. Very powerful program. And in the process became his student and got deeply into that path. But I still had this shadow life going on that I kept secret from him and everyone else, where I'd disappear once or twice a year to South America and do a smuggling run. So I had to split life of spending about half the year in serious pursuit of Buddhism and practice and retreats and traveling with him and really, sincerely involved. But then another part of the year involved in this craziness, right? And crazier lifestyle. And I knew that had to come to an end. I was self-medicating around the cognitive dissonance around it. But before I did eventually stop, but other people I've been involved with continued and got in trouble and decided to invite me along. And so I was eventually indicted in 1985 and decided to turn myself in on my teacher's advice, decided to turn myself in. And so I ended up going to prison for 14 years. But at that point, I'd already been, I had a lot of training under my belt. I had a master's degree in basically clinical psychology, clinical psychotherapy, and I've been training as a Buddhist and trained to teach already for 10 years. So I came into prison with a lot of skills and a lot of background. So it's kind of a mixed bag of a life journey.
Yeah, I have been. Thank you for sharing that. What a journey it has been. I have been listening to your book on Audible, and I was really moved by the moment where you talk about standing up on the toilet seat or the bathroom or your bathroom sink, whatever it was, and looking out into the night sky and having that, I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it, but having that moment where you decided, I'm not going to give up. No matter what my sentence will be, I'm not going to give up. And that it was really about kind of an internal locus of control, perhaps, and also wanting to give your son something, someone to look up to, and that he would be proud of what you'd become. And it was very powerful in that visual of just trying to seek something beautiful amidst where you were. Tell me about that situation of trying to become something really amazing for your son. How was that kind of a catalyst for you, being mindful of the fact that this was a difficult situation for your wife and your son, and how you not only tethered to it, but really stayed tethered to it? Is that the case? I assume that was the case. You stayed tethered to it. It was kind of maybe a sense of North Star, perhaps.
And it wasn't so much that I was trying to become amazing. I was just trying to leave my son a better legacy than just his dad went to prison, right? Or even his dad died in prison, because I had no surety that I'd survive my time. Yeah, it was a seminal moment that I'm grateful for. Something just came over me, and I just had this absolute clarity that I was facing a potential life sentence the next day,
Right.
And a no parole sentence. Whatever I got was it, and I was facing
You're
anywhere
35.
from.
Or 35 at the
Sorry?
time, right? You were 35 at the time,
I was
right?
35, yeah.
Yeah.
And but the next, so I was facing that sentencing the next day, and I just absolute clarity. No matter what happened, I was not going to give up on myself, my life, my son, my practice, and so forth. And the the next day I was sentenced to 30 years with no parole. And the paper the next morning said I'd be 65 before I had any chance of release. So I pretty much thought my life as I'd known it was over, and I'd really kind of torched my life. But more than anything else, what hit me was what I'd done to my son, who was now going to grow up without a dad. And so I went through a real kind of dark night of the soul around that. And I was still in this hellhole of a county jail, but eventually I got transferred to the federal prison where I did my time. And when I got there, I was pretty caught up in the drama of my own situation, as you can imagine. I've just been sentenced to 30 years, no parole, and what I've done to my family, my son, myself, and imagining being in prison for all this time, and a lot of fear around that. And so I get to this prison, and I did my they moved me around a few different prisons and transfer, but eventually I got there, and where I did my time was the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners, which is in Springfield, Missouri, and it's the maximum security federal prison hospital for the federal. There are other federal prison hospitals, but this is the highest security one. So all the patients there come from the federal penitentiaries, the high security penitentiaries like Lewisburg and Lompoc and Atlanta and others. And so I get there, and it's a big complex. They have like 10 buildings, and they're all connected with these tunnels that are half underground, half above ground. So there's a little light you can get. There's some light that comes in from the part that's above ground, but you can move around the whole complex, all the building, without ever having to go outside. And there's a lot of gates. There's controlled movements. You can only move on the hour and so forth. But I got there, and I'm just walking down. I'll never forget that first time. There's a place where they bring in prisoners and where they eventually release prisoners as well. So I went through the whole process of being brought in and all the shaming exercises that are part of that, and by intention or not, but it is a very shaming process. And now I'm in my prison clothes, and I'm walking down the hall, and one of these tunnels, and I'm seeing men who are blind being with a white cane on their own or assisted along the hall. I'm seeing men being wheeled in wheelchairs who are incredibly emaciated from AIDS and cancer. I'm seeing men who are quadriplegic and paraplegic in wheelchairs. I'm seeing men coming out of the psychiatric ward doing the Halidol or Thorazine two-step, or it was like a Fellini movie of suffering, and it just shocked me. And I'm actually very grateful for that, because it shocked me out of the preoccupation with my own situation. And I realized I was in this world of tremendous suffering. And so just thankfully, what then kicked in was the aspiration to serve, to just show up and serve. And that was based on really the influence of my spiritual teacher, who was someone who I was very close to and had watched very closely for years. And as far as I could tell, he never had any other motivation in life than serving humanity, and he did that 24/7. And despite the problems of my family, I had a good basic, a good family with good values and service oriented, community oriented, so I'm here in this hell realm, and I've got some training. So how can I serve, right? And I got a job teaching school. That was my day job for 14 years, teaching school, helping other prisoners learn to read or get their GED or study correspondence college courses. And but the main thing was it shifted me from that self-preoccupation with my own situation to realizing, I didn't quite conceptualize it that I was there for a reason, but nonetheless, it was just, okay, here I am, let's serve. And so, as a result of that, I got very involved in relating with the various communities in the prison, got involved with a service organization that was going up into the medical units, providing support, showing the prison movies to patients that couldn't go down to the gym to see them, things like that. I started a meditation group in the chapel, which they didn't particularly want me to do, but by hook or crook, eventually got that going. And so I was running that, leading that twice a week. I got very involved in my own 12-step work, and I was really kind of a backbone in service work of that program for those 14 years, and the 12-step programming. And then I got very concerned about the plight of they they were starting to bring all the AIDS patients there from all the federal penitentiaries. And there was a lot of fear amongst the prisoner population there because there had been no education around AIDS. And they thought, well, they're bringing them all here to see if we get AIDS, right? And there was a lot of fear. And so the prison was putting the AIDS patients back in a psych ward in a locked unit for their own protection. And so I was taking the movie projector back there, and I was getting to know them a little bit. I got very concerned about their plight. And I started reaching out to outside organizations and the growing AIDS movement, and seeing how I could help. And through that, I ended up getting in touch with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I developed a long-term friendship with her and Stephen Andrea Levine and others. And but then eventually I brought it up to a chaplain. I said, do you think we could get a hospice program going here? And I wasn't even really that clear what a hospice was, but I had some idea. And he said, well, you should talk to the medical surgical psychologist, and he's been talking to somebody else interested in that. And so anyway, there was another prisoner that had similar ideas. He was thinking more of it was kind of a little more religiously focused. He was volunteer program. But anyway, we got together. We ended up trying to, put together a hospice program. And so we did. It took a while. We had to put quite a few proposals in. They kept getting turned down by this one associate warden. But then he got transferred out, and they brought another associate warden in that was over programs and religious services and things. And that one had recently had an experience with hospice with his own family, and was really, most people who've been through a hospice experience realize how amazing it is and how amazing the people that work in a hospice are. And so he said, well, let's give this a try. And so we recruited people from the outside community, from local hospitals and hospice programs and so forth, to come in and train a group of 10 prisoners, the two of us and 8 other prisoners we recruited. And then we started seeing our first patients. And we started training in 87, started being our first patient in 1988. So this was, as far as we know, the first hospice inside a prison anywhere in the world. And that became a big part of my life for the rest of my time. I usually had 2, sometimes 3 patients. 3 was a lot because I was up all my meal breaks. I was up there in the hospital helping them, eat, helping, bathing them, helping them communicate with their family, taking them to religious service, taking them out to the yard. So that was a huge part of my life. And these became very, very, they were more like surrogate family relationships. Prisoners had this kind of radar around being able to trust each other. When you'd meet a new, hospice patient, and they kind of check you out, and as soon as they figured they could trust you, they just bring you in and make you their like maybe they were older or younger or same age or whatever the relationship was, but you became like a family member, and they're very close relationships. You spent a lot of time together, and it was very powerful work. You're confronted with your own mortality because there, but for the grace of whatever you believe in, go you. And in fact, some of my patients were younger than I was, and I had never been tested for AIDS yet, and I'd been an IV drug user. I easily could have had AIDS. And as also, we had 2 hospice volunteers, healthy hospice volunteers, who, while there, got sick, became hospice patients, and died there. One of them was a very close friend of mine, and the other one, actually, I became his hospice volunteer. So, you're really confronted with your own mortality and this act of service of being in a situation where somebody else's needs are so compelling. And, somebody who's terminally ill and dying in a situation, they have almost no access to their family. Even most of their friends are probably back at the penitentiary where they came from. They're isolated up in these locked medical wards. I mean, they have no choices about medical care. The food isn't great, and often some of the prisoner nursing attendants get jobs in the hospital just to steal. So they steal the best food and they steal people's stuff, and so it's a very rough situation. And so you're there with a person, and it's just so obvious their needs are paramount, right? So you learn to set your own needs aside, at least temporarily. You put your focus on someone else's needs rather than your own, and that's an incredibly not in a self-sacrificing way, but just in a moment. Okay, this is about this person, and I'm here to support this person. That's an incredibly transformative thing, and that hospice service was an incredibly transformative part of my life there all those years. But, really, I ended up being able to do research on it and publishing research, and then started a national organization to get that model out in the world. And that's the National Prison Hospice Association. And as a result of that, there's probably about 80 state and federal prison hospice programs in this country now, and a few internationally as well. And so that was, a big part of my life there. And also, I was living this really incredibly disciplined life. But the minute I got to that prison, I realized if I'm going to be able to do anything good here, it's going to come out of my practice, right? It's not going to come out of talking about, thinking about it. It's going to come out of my practice. So I was literally practicing like my hair was on fire, practicing hours every day, much longer on weekends, living in big dorms to begin with and staying on the top bunk. So I had head clearance to meditate. And then later I started using these trash closets and taking everything out of them and going there and sit. And eventually I was able to get a single cell. But, that was the foundation of my life. I spent 2 or 3 hours a day practicing, 2 or 3 hours a day studying, as well as being involved in all this service work and having a regular day job. So I didn't sleep very much. The first probably 7, 8 years, I slept 4 or 5 hours a night. I seemed to be able to get away with that. I was just driven. I was on fire to practice and serve and get all the negativity out of my life. And so it became a very transformative time of my life. And in the context of living in this incredibly negative environment, on a good day in prison, you maybe only have a half dozen incredibly demeaning encounters with your fellow prisoners or with the staff, right? That's on a good day, right? It's just a very negative environment, potentially very violent environment. And, so your humanity and your sense of self-worth, your sense of your own personhood is just under assault all the time. And I was fortunate that I came in there with a strong practice and a lot of resilience, right? Because most people come out of prison much worse than they go in. For me, it became a very transformational journey, and I'm very grateful for that. But a lot of times when I'm being interviewed and things, people say, "Well, it seemed like it in some ways it was very good for you and part of your journey." I said, "Yes, and for most people, it's not. For most people, it's very destructive, and our prison system needs a lot of work, to say the least." And I've dedicated my life to that.
So tell me more about dedicating your life to this. So we've talked quite a bit about the hospice program, which I appreciate you sharing about that. What a beautiful service to folks who probably don't have the support that they need, and probably just don't even have access to it, even if they did have folks who would come around them. So what a beautiful service that is, and that it's caught like wildfire around our nation. What else have you done in the prison institutes? You've done practices with other inmates. You've helped also train some of the wardens. That's also part of what your practice has been too?
I led that group for 14 years there, twice a week, teaching meditation to whoever showed up. Okay. But at some point, I started publishing in various journals in the kind of contemplative world, things like Yoga Journal and Tricycle Magazine, Shambhala Sun Magazine, Lion's Roar Magazine, different ones. And so I was kind of becoming well known as this Buddhist prisoner a little bit. And there wasn't a lot of well-organized Buddhist prison ministry back then. It was just a little, not much. But prisoners were reaching out to meditation centers and Buddhist sanghas around the country, seeking support for their interest. And so quite a few places started sending the letters to me. And then, "We don't know what to do with this. We'll send them to Fleet." I wasn't allowed to correspond with prisoners in other federal prisons, but I got away with doing it with prisoners in state prisons and county jails. It was kind of a gray area, but I just did it. I didn't hide it, because you can't hide the mail. You put your mail in the box, and I put in a mail addressed to some state prison, right? Prison number on it, right? Nobody ever stopped me. I just kept doing it. And, I would get a letter from somebody, and I worked in the education department. I also was where the copy center was. And, there was always a prisoner that running the copy center, and I always knew them. And so I could take a magazine, and get an article about meditation copied or something. So I put that together, a little note, and I put it and sent it to somebody. And I knew they were really going to be happy to get this, right? So it was a very kind of joyful thing to be able to do and serve. But I very quickly realized this was much bigger than something I could do from my prison cell. And so I managed to recruit some help on the outside and raised a little money from family and friends. And I really, initially I just had somebody on the outside who was like a mail drop for me. They would mail me all the paperwork I needed to start a nonprofit. I would fill it all out, send it back to them. They would mail it, to the IRS, back and forth like that. So managed to establish a nonprofit, and then raise a little money, and then started recruiting friends and people on the outside to be prison pen pals with people, and also to donate books to send for free to prisoners on meditation and Dharma, things like that. So we got that started back in 1989. And today it's a very large organization with 3 divisions. And we still do the work with supporting at-risk, incarcerated, and returning youth and adults. And we do it ourselves, and we train other people to do it. We have a curriculum called Path of Freedom, which is all over the world, and is reaching now. It's reaching through secure tablets that are becoming a big part of prisoner education. It's reaching, it's already reached something like 60,000 prisoners through that, and pretty soon it's going to be available to over 1 million prisoners. And but our in-person, we train people to do in-person programming, which kind of all went on hold during the pandemic, but it's starting to happen again. So we had Path Freedom programs in something like 37 states and 10 countries, something like that. And then we've had post-release programs, and both working with people coming out of jail and prison, but also out of homelessness and so forth. Then we have another division called Center for Mindfulness and Public Safety, and that's where we train correctional officers, probation and parole officers, and other first responders, police, work with the U.S. Border Patrol. We've worked with lots of sheriff's departments, lots of different state departments of corrections. We do a lot of work in Canada. And then we have another division where we train mindfulness teachers. We train mindfulness teachers who are going to, we would call it the Engaged Mindfulness Institute. And our niche is kind of training mindfulness teachers who are going to work with in areas where there is a lot of trauma and a lot of suffering, a lot of marginalization. So not just prison work, but could be homelessness, could be lots of different things. But we train them in, trauma-informed, neuroscientific informed approaches to teaching mindfulness. So all that happens under that nonprofit, and that's still a big part of my life. We have our whole staff, and we have an executive director, but I'm still a president, chair of the board, and very involved. I mean, I do a lot of teaching through the organization. I travel and work with correctional officers and probation and parole officers, and like that. So it's still a big part of my life, as well as I have all the other work I do through Heart Mind Institute. Mm-hmm.
Well, this is wonderful to hear about all of this. And I have a number of other questions for you to dig into your practice and how you define some things to help me and our listeners know more about your practice. And so I'd love to hear how you define mindfulness.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Been an ongoing dialogue about that with my colleague and our executive director at Prison Mindfulness Institute, Vita Pyers. And Dr. Vita Pyers, she just got her PhD, did her dissertation on the kind of the Theravada Vipassana Polycanon approach to mindfulness as a means for preventing and resolving conflict. Really brilliant work that she did. And so we had a lot of conversation about what is mindfulness. And I actually recently interviewed the cognitive science Buddhist psychologist and philosopher John Vervaeke for one of my summits. And we were talking about that a little bit. And so the definition everybody cites all the time is the famous Jon Kabat-Zinn definition of mindfulness, right? Paying attention on purpose in a particular way and non-judgmentally. And Vervaeke doesn't like that definition so much. I don't have a bigger problem with it. I've spread it myself. I've used it a lot. And it's not like Vervaeke thinks John's done amazing work as he has, but it's a bit limited, the definition. And it focuses on the attention part for one thing. Now of course, Jon Kabat-Zinn has also promoted these 9 attitudinal qualities of mindfulness, which is a really important part. In some ways, there's another model that's in the literature talking about mindfulness as a 3-legged stool, which I've used a lot as well, where one leg is attention training. You're definitely training your attention and developing your capacity to switch attention, to self-direct attention, stabilize attention. But another leg of the stool is intention. So what's your intentionality? So having a benevolent intention, right, around becoming mindful, to awaken, to become more compassionate, to become more altruistic, to serve, as opposed to training your attention to, well, the classic example people use is to be a sniper, for example, right? They use breath work, they train their attention, right? And, unfortunately, we live in a world where maybe snipers are still necessary, but we live in a dangerous world. But at any rate, so intention, having a benevolent intention, and then the third leg are these attitudinal qualities, things like openness, curiosity, beginner's mind, non-judgment, self-compassion, self-acceptance, gratitude, generosity, all these qualities. So you're infusing that attention with these qualities, right? That attention, you're infusing the so. But more broadly, I would say that, first of all, mindfulness has really kind of become the catch-all term, right, for the modern mindfulness movement, right? But it's really mindfulness and awareness, right? It's mindfulness and awareness training. And mindfulness tends to be, it's not exclusively so, but the mindfulness aspect of mindfulness and awareness training is a little more focused on the attention training, the concentration, and one point of focus. Not completely, and then awareness is a little broader, more panoramic. But they're both included under the rubric mindfulness, as the word's used today in the secular mainstream mindfulness movement. And, it draws, Buddhism is not the only source for mindfulness training. All the great traditions and shamanic traditions, human beings have been figuring out how to, the benefits of being present and being awake for a long time across all different traditions. But the kind of classic techniques that are used in a modern mindfulness movement mostly do come from and most of them come from the Theravadan Pali kind of Vipassana, what is often called Vipassana. But actually, Zen meditation is not that different. And, in the Tibetan tradition, we talk about shamatha and Vipassana. And really, that's more, so that is the mindfulness and awareness. It's the concentration and the insight. Or sometimes called tranquility insight. And so, broadly speaking, mindfulness is a practice for working with our mind and bringing forth our best innate qualities. Working with our mind, working with our body, heart, and mind, working with the whole thing, and bringing forth our ideal innate qualities of compassion, altruism, generosity, kindness, gentleness, non-aggression, and so forth. And it is also about being more present, about being awake, being fully present. And so it really incorporates a lot, and there's a lot of subtlety to it. And in different traditions, the various meditation practices and the ways of working with your mind and discovering the subtleties of our conditioning, and how our world is obscured by the filters of our conditioning and by conceptuality. I mean, it's a very, very, very deep path and has a lot of dimensionality to it, right? And probably, the Tibetan Buddhist tradition may have taken it as deep as anyone. But there are many, many different traditions of working with it. So it's really a broad subject, and it often gets kind of reduced down to one simple thing, which it's not. But I would say it is about learning to really be awake and be present in the midst of our lives, instead of just walking through our lives daydreaming or in a very reactionary kind of robot-like way with our conditioning. So it's about being awake, and it's about bringing forth our best qualities and sort of dissolving the obstacles to those qualities, and developing over time a life where we're more connected with our own innate goodness, the innate goodness of others, that we've actually dropped beneath all the noise into that depth of our being where we realize actually we're not broken, we don't need fixing. There is a part of our being that's never been touched by any of the trauma. It's whole, it's pure, it's completely good. And even just having a little toehold down there can change everything. And then we also realize that everybody has that, no matter how they're behaving currently or how problematic they may be. that the ground of their being is also basic goodness, and whatever untoward behaviors are happening is just coming out of their own suffering, out of their own conditioning. But the life is good. The underlying quality of life itself is innate goodness, innate wholeness, and so it's really about finding ways to be in touch with that, so one can live one's life with less fear and more confidence. When you think about what do the vast majority of human beings do every day, every morning, all over the planet, they get up, they do the best to take care of themselves, take care of their kids. We're amazingly cooperative. We queue up at the well, at the store, we drive on the right side of the road. We're amazingly cooperative and collaborative and so forth, except when fear sets in. Now, if fear sets in around being able to get our basic needs met, the higher degree of fear, we can get involved in some pretty untoward behaviors. But so if we really want a more benevolent world, we just need to remove more of the fear. So another way I think of looking at mindfulness is getting in touch with life, with our own being, and the way our being is completely interdependent with and completely connected with life and reality. The more one is in touch with that, the more the fear goes away, and one is able to live one's life with a lot of ease and grace and gentleness and compassion and altruism and so forth. So I think mindfulness includes all the ways in which we do that.
I love that. I will say, as I was listening to your book, what struck me was this concept of innate goodness. And I thought, wow, because I feel like most of my life, and maybe it's a cultural thing, I feel like most of my life it has been spent trying to instill this thought that I wasn't good or enough or all the things. And I thought, what a beautiful freedom, and what a radical way to look at ourselves and other people, to honor their innate goodness. And if that came first before anything else, I just wonder how much different the world would be, and how much differently we would act as individuals. Just that
Yeah,
one thing.
absolutely. Unfortunately, if you look historically and cross-culturally, the view of innate goodness is actually the dominant view. There's three basic views of human nature. If you look historically and cross-culturally, there's the blank slate view. We come into life just as a blank slate, and we're just influenced by whatever we're influenced for good or bad. There's the view of innate goodness, that we are innately good. And then there's the view of some kind of innate badness, the fallen nature of humanity. And really the dominant view has been that of innate goodness. So you wouldn't know it living in the West because, unfortunately, and, I'm a lover of all the great spiritual traditions. And I think this was an unfortunate twist on Christianity. But the development of, especially in Calvinist Protestantism, this idea of the fallen nature of humanity, the depraved nature of humanity, even the original sin notion from the Catholic tradition is problematic. It's not quite as bad as that one if you really study and understand what it's about. I mean, if you really understood our original sin properly, I would say in Buddhism, it's how we talk about our conditioning and the ego. It's the challenge we have. The problem is they call it original. That's where they made a mistake, because it's not original. Goodness is original, which is why Matthew Fox, the Dominican priest who was excommunicated, and now he's an Anglican priest, wrote the book Original Blessing, kind of as to contrast it with that teaching of original sin. But again, I think these are misconceptions, misfortunate twist on the original teachings of Jesus, but as a result of that, our West has really got a strong thread of this, and really a lot of shame and blame in the culture. And if we really think, basically, in our culture, there's this really strong thread of that, and it's basically the idea that absent some threat, some coercive threat of ostracization, shaming, imprisonment, whatever punishment, absent that, human beings won't behave well. That they require that threat to behave well. So, in other words, we have this kind of seed of evil in us, and absent some coercive threat, we won't behave well. And so, if that's the belief, what kind of society you create? What kind of institutions you create? That's why we have the prison to school pipeline that many talk about today. Our schools are set up based around that same thing. They're, and so we have a culture that's kind of, this punishment, reward, carrot and stick, and a lot of shaming and blaming, and it's unfortunate because even if you take actually that first chapter in Radical Responsibility, I originally had a longer version of that chapter. Like when you write a book, you always have to, you work with the editor, you have to shrink things a lot. But in that longer version, I did these thought experiments. So whichever view you believe or want to, let's just do a thought experiment. Let's say, take on the view of that human nature is somehow inherently bad or evil, and unless you coerce people, they're dangerous. Or now just live extrapolate your life living with that view, and what kind of society we're going to have with that view. And then take the blank slate, and I went through the same, and then take the view of innate goodness. Which world do you want to live in? Regardless of which one you can say is ultimately true, I mean, based on what you believe, that's kind of the world you're going to create, right? I happen to believe innate basic goodness is ultimately true, but even if it was just a view, you're going to create a very different world with that view than you are with the view of innate badness, right? So anyway, I think it underlies everything I do. It's the core principle and teaching within all the work I do. When I go into prisons, if prisoners get nothing else from me, I want them to not just get me speaking it, but I want them to feel from my presence and who I am and the way I'm being with them. I want them to connect with their own innate goodness.
I love that. My husband, I'm sorry, my father actually passed away a couple weeks into the pandemic, and
Sorry to hear that.
thank you. He was a wonderful man, very generous, one of the kindest hearts I've ever met, and I gave a eulogy. So as we were at the graveyard, which it was 2 weeks into the pandemic, everybody's wearing masks. We're all spread out. I mean, it looks like post-apocalyptic, right? We're spread out many feet from each other, and I'm giving this speech, and I shared lessons from his life, and actually that was really similar to one of them that I shared, which was that he taught me that as you see and treat someone, that's how they'll show up. It's kind of a visualization of seeing their best selves. Like if you believe in the best version of someone and you treat them that they're that person, that's who they are. And I think it's a beautiful concept. So thank you for sharing that as part of your life mission. It's very, very lovely. You talked earlier about having a routine while you were in prison that was 2 to 3 hours of practicing and reading and whatnot. I'm wondering about now that you have a lot of institutions that you've founded, and you have a wonderful, beautiful wife, and just so much going on. You have a consulting business, and the list could go on and on and on. You have a lot going on in your life, Fleet. And you don't need me to tell you that. You know that. What's your routine look like? Can you give us a glimpse into how Fleet Maull stays mindful on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. Well, I'm a big believer in the power of a morning routine.
Same.
Sometimes I call it a ceremony, sometimes a ritual. And, like Tony Robbins talks about having your hour of power, or lots of different people talk about that in the kind of performance sense. And so the first 2 hours of my day is totally focused on self-care and spiritual practice, but sometimes more like 2.5 hours. So I get up and I do a lot of stretching before I even got out of bed. And the stretching I do, I also synchronize it with breath work. So I'm doing deep breath work and stretching, kind of this yoga work. And then I swing my legs over to the side of the bed and I do more breath work. And I get up, make my bed, then I get on the floor and do more yoga, more breath work. And when I've completed that whole routine, then I go in and do the bathroom thing, my shower and everything. And then I meet my wife, Sophie, in our meditation room. We have a room upstairs set aside for meditation with our Buddhist shrine and so forth. And I go in there and we do about an hour, anywhere from an hour to an hour and 15 minutes of practice. Sometimes a little longer, sometimes a little shorter, but pretty consistently, at least an hour and 15 minutes. And we do a lot of different types of meditation practice. There's always some basic sitting, mindfulness and awareness sitting practice, but we do a lot of liturgical practices and visualization practices. We both practice in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. We've both been Sophie's been practicing for over 3 decades, and I've been practicing for over 5 decades in that tradition. So we're both do a lot of the inner yogic practices. And so we're always doing different practices. And then I make a real, have, developed a real strong conscious intent to practice. Then we finish that practice. We come downstairs and we have we used to have a really nutritional breakfast together. Now she has a very nutritional breakfast, and I'm now in the intermittent fasting. So I don't have my breakfast till around 11 a.m. or noon. So that's gotten our breakfast allows us, but sometimes I'll just sit down while she's having breakfast. But anyway, we create a solid foundation for our day. And then I've created real strong intentionality around practicing presence during the day and also doing a lot of breath work. So I'm always doing breath work and as I'm working. I have a lot of thought that we have a 2-story house. So anytime I'm going up and down the steps, I've trained myself to just really slow down and really be present. We get out, we have a dog, so we get out and walk the dog, play with the dog, do things. So I'm really conscious about bringing presence to all these things, different activities. I'm the main dishwasher in our house. So when I'm washing dishes, I do that at a sink because the window looks out at the Connecticut River. So I really enjoy just slow down, appreciate, connecting with the elements, the water, the suds, watch this, get this. So I've really focused on, I learned because early on in my life, I was really working and trying to practice and I often felt that, okay, I had my practice and, whatever would happen then. And then when I got off the cushion, went back into my life, it was just kind of off to the races. It didn't seem like the two were connecting very much.
I understand that.
And, and I realized at some point it takes a lot of intentionality. I mean, if you're practicing regularly, it is going to infuse your life in some ways, but it can infuse your life a lot more directly if you bring a lot of intentionality to that, of really taking your life as mindfulness practice. So you're doing mindful driving, mindful walking, mindful eating, and using your life to awaken and really working with embodiment as well. That's been a really big part of my work for the last 20, almost 30 years of embodiment and body work, and really learning to live in the body, fully connected to the body, and developing much greater interoceptive awareness of the internal sensory landscape of the body, which really grounds us, right? And it also helps us, the more interoceptive awareness we have, it also enhances our ability to connect with others and connect with the world around us. So we're just more connected, right? So I really work at making that happen. And and create transitions in my day and doing a lot of breath work. So I am able to work really hard and do a lot and be pretty busy, but also maintain a lot of equanimity and spaciousness. And, and then, I also have an evening routine that I do of slowing things down and letting go of things and, spending some time with my wife. And I try to get 8 hours of sleep every night and rest well. And I have these wearables to check on, the quality of my sleep. And, I'm really trying to perform at a high level. And using, both the ancient wisdom and contemplative practices and current technologies to perform at my best.
Excellent. You have written this book, Radical Responsibility. You also have a podcast, Radical Responsibility Podcast. Tell me about why responsibility, why radical responsibility, and why is it so pivotal to who you are and your mission?
Well, this philosophy for me was really birthed in prison. When I got that environment, I think, as I mentioned before, I realized it was an incredibly negative environment. And, most of my fellow prisoners are walking around with a big victim story. People tend to think, they are the victimizers, the perpetrators, right? But, all prisoners feel victimized. And actually, most of them have horrific childhoods. People are programmed to end up in prison, which doesn't absolve them of responsibility for their actions, but still, when you learn about most people that end up in prison, and most of them had even much worse situations than I had, much worse. And then they feel over prosecuted, and they feel their lawyer did them wrong or their ball partners did them wrong, and they all, and kind of the ritual when you'd meet somebody in prison there's a big yard. Fortunately, where I was, they had a big yard and they have softball field out there, but a big walking track. You can walk so you'd go out there and you'd walk a few laps and you'd talk, and they'd share their victim story, you share your victim story. But after I did that a few times, I was like done with that ritual. I didn't want to hear my own at all. And I really didn't want to hear theirs, which wasn't very compassionate, but it's just not where I wanted to live. And I realized that, if I didn't proactively do otherwise, I could come out of prison, pretty embittered and broke. I didn't want to end up that way. And also, just all that negativity and, having a chip on your shoulder and, it's hard to describe how negative the prison environment is. And I didn't want to come out of prison that way if I was lucky enough to survive, but I didn't want to live that way there. So I knew I had to take charge of managing myself to not have that happen. But I also realized that, in terms of thinking of my own victim story, I didn't want to dwell there. I did a lot of people's time because I refused to cooperate with the authorities, not because I was trying to be some hard guy or stand-up guy. It's just my values, but somebody else is going to go to prison instead of me. Somebody else's family is going to suffer instead of me. It just I was never going to do that. But lots of people did. And of course, the government comes in and they threaten, they're going to take your children away, they're going to do this, they scare the hell out of people, right? So it's understandable that people do. And so, because I didn't cooperate, that's why I became the designated kingpin and got this no parole sentence, and there were probably 50 people that cooperated and testified, and most of whom I never met before. But they knew people who knew people who knew people, I guess, some of these networks of, and so, I did a lot of people's time, including some people that had previously ostensibly been quite close to me. So I could have really focused on my anger around that. And also the government, when they prosecute you, they don't play by the rules. They break all the laws. They break all their own rules. They play hardball. And, so I could have focused on all that. And I said, that's not going to get me anywhere. I knew that right away. Fortunately, I'd had enough, Buddhist training, enough psychological training to that's not going to get me anywhere. The only way I'm going to get through this and be able to do anything with my life, again, to leave my son a better legacy than just his dad went to prison or died in prison, is I got to embrace like 200% responsibility for having got myself into this and what I'm going to do with it. Now, I did earn my way there, so it wasn't hard to find things it wasn't hard to find things to own, but I chose to just forget about all the rest of it and just focus on owning, how I had created this situation and how I was going to create something different. And as a result, and I really just right away early on bought into that in a radical way. And, and I'd also realized that even in terms of my Buddhist practice, I had been like many people of my generation in in the early days of Western Buddhism, I was mostly interested in the mind, the awareness practices, the meditative experiences. I was really giving short shrift to the ethical foundations of Buddhism, the precept practices. And obviously I couldn't have been smuggling drugs and, if I'd been following that. So that became a real focus for me. My life in prison was going to be completely grounded in the precepts of non-harming and non-stealing and non-lying, no misuse of intoxicants and sexuality and all that. I just, and then I became a monk, and I took the novice precepts, which is even more. And I just really focused on, and I also really it became really clear to me that there's no free lunches in life, and that karma is real. And so, if I came up to a vending machine and it was a quarter and I left it there, I don't want the karma. I'm suffering a lot. I don't know when I created this karma that I'm going through right now, but okay, enough. I'm not, I got the message. I don't want to create any more, So I was just real clear about all these things. And a result of that philosophy of radical ownership, which has nothing to do with self-blame. It's obviously not about blaming others, but it has nothing to do with blaming oneself, and it has nothing to do with blaming victims. It's just about owning your choices, living at choice. And as a result of that, I was able to do things you're not supposed to be able to do when you're in prison. I was able to start 2 national organizations and create all kinds of programs in that prison, and that, had a lasting impact and effect and benefit a lot of people. I don't say that to pat myself on the back. I just say that to, say what can come out of that approach. I didn't demonize the staff or the guards or anything. I just saw them all as human beings. And the way I got things done. I didn't fight. I just showed up consistently, maybe persistently, but consistently and respectfully. And I just kept showing, and sooner or later was able to, push the right buttons so that people said, well, maybe that is a good idea. Maybe we could try that. Let's do that, and was able to accomplish a lot of things there. But it was from this approach of really honoring my basic Buddhist training and values, but this approach of radical responsibility, which sometimes the way I describe that is voluntarily embracing 100% ownership for each and every circumstance we face in life. And when we look at the circumstances we're facing in life with at least a modest amount of self-honesty, we can see we had something to do with quite a few of them, right? We either created it whole cloth, or we at least co-created it, or we allowed it by not paying attention or not doing our due diligence or not having good boundaries, or we just stumbled into it, or there was something in it for us. We were people pleasing, or enabling, or there are all kinds of ways in which we're participating in co-creating the circumstances we face in life. And we don't look at all that for the purpose of blaming ourselves, not at all. We look at it for the purpose of learning, because if I can see how I got into a situation I don't like, then I've learned something. I can do something different next time. Or even the situations I do like, rather than just thinking that's, serendipitous. No, it's all causation. So, I can learn to self-regulate in a way that I'm creating the causes of happiness for myself instead of creating the causes of suffering for myself and others. So it's all about learning. And then of course, it's very important while you're doing that, because we're all prone to self-blame, right? And it's in a culture. So that's why the importance of really cultivating this, developing this, confidence in our own innate goodness through practice, but also really practicing self-compassion and befriending ourselves, becoming our own best friends. Really important to do that in order to be able to embrace this level of radical ownership without it getting twisted into self-blame. And then there's going to be circumstances that, no matter how radically honest we get, we just don't see we had anything to do with it. And everyone would agree, unless it has to do with past lives, and who knows about such things, right? We don't see we had anything to do with it. But there it is. And we may need to, and horrible things happen to human beings. I'm not saying people aren't victimized. And so we may need to receive a lot of validation, a lot of support. We may even need to seek justice, but doing that from an empowered position, a place of owning our choices, as opposed to getting locked into that victim mindset, is very different. And so even the situations that we can't see we had anything to do with, we still own those. Why? Because what we're going to own is not that we caused it. And there's some horrible things that happen to us. Even if I see I had some small play, that doesn't justify that it happened. It's horrible. It shouldn't happen to anybody. But still, I can learn something there. I can learn how to maybe avoid it in the future. But even if I don't see any connection, then at some point, the most salient question is, okay, it's in my life. Maybe it shouldn't be in my life, shouldn't be anybody's life. Maybe it's completely unjust and criminal and horrible and shouldn't be there, but it is. So what am I going to do with it? At some point, that's the salient question. What am I going to do? Am I going to let it take me down? Or am I going to find the most creative way I can respond to move my life forward? And so that, it's about really living at choice. And it's not that we're not going to find ourselves, feeling, all the feelings and emotions. It's not about repressing anything, but it's just saying, okay, yeah, that's all there. I'm going to give myself compassion around this. I'm going to realize this is really hard, and I'm going to shift my focus to what can I do? What can I do to move my own life forward in, with a long-term, enlightened self-interest, which is more long-term, which usually works out to be in everybody else's interest as well. When you have that kind of long, enlightened self-interest is really long-term interest, right? I mean, in shorthand, when you're pissed at somebody, it might feel good to hit them, but, that's going to lead to all kinds of problems you probably don't want to have, right? So the enlightened self-interest, long-term interest is usually in everybody's interest. And so, it's living from that question, what can I do? We call that the magical radical responsibility question. No matter what situation I'm in, how horrible it is, and I find myself, I'm kvetching and feeling hopeless and powerless, and it's horrible, and then I stop. Okay, take a breath. Okay, I don't like this. This sucks. What can I do? Immediately, I'm back in the mind of possibility. There's always a million things we can do. There's a million different ways we can approach any given situation. So it's about living from choice. It's about how we learn as much as we can from our life experience, and how do we spend as much of our time in an empowered place of choice and less of our time in that victim mindset, which doesn't mean we're ignoring our feelings or not being compassionate to ourselves and others at all.
Sure. And it seems like you've kind of answered this question that I had as a follow-up, kind of this, when folks are up against a wall, when maybe they're looking at a life sentence, or maybe something, in their lives is coming to a head, and they realize maybe they have caused some deep hurt. Maybe they are in a position where it feels like there's no way out. It sounds like your answer is radical responsibility.
Yeah.
Take the bull by the horns. Admit where you
Yeah.
come into play, and where
A lot of it
life
may
is
have to
just
do with
life.
working on self-forgiveness, working on forgiving others, working on learning to self-regulate, developing a mindfulness practice so you can actually recognize your choices instead of just being driven along by your childhood conditioning all the time, but actually, learning to recognize our moments of choice. And, we got to do the work. If we want a different life, we got to do the work. When I go into prisons, I want and everybody in prison, I mean, they're all my brothers and sisters because I spent enough time there, it became part of my life, part of my world. And it breaks my heart that any human being has to be locked up. And, there are human beings doing things for which I would agree they should be locked up, at least temporarily, until they can make some shift. And maybe there are some people that have to stay locked up forever because they got so damaged that they're just not able to turn it around in this lifetime. But we can still treat them with dignity. But when I go into prisons, I want the prisoners I work with, talk to, interact with, teach meditation to, I want them to get two things, uh, two principal things anyway. I want them to get that I get that, for the vast majority of them, they've been victimized terribly in their lives. And many of them come from incredibly painful backgrounds full of trauma. And I get that in most cases, they've been over prosecuted. And I get that our criminal justice system is incredibly racist, whether by design or default, but the impact of the way people of color are arrested, prosecuted, the sentencing, the whole thing all the way through is incredibly biased and incredibly unjust. So I want them to get that I get all that. And they do, because that's who I am. And they get that. And I also want them to get that regardless of all that. And I want them to get that I feel tremendous empathy and compassion. And it breaks my heart to see them in the situation they're in. And I get how they got there. And it's not their fault. Most of them were programmed to get where they got. And I want them to get that their future, their destiny, what's going to happen tomorrow, the next day, and any possibility they have of getting out and having a different life has to do with one and one only thing. And that's the choices they're making right now, today and tomorrow and the next day. Their choices, their actions, their behaviors. That's what's going to determine their future, nothing else. And if they're full of anger about the injustice, okay, well, get your act together and get out of prison and go out and change the world. But to do that, you're going to have to train yourself. You're going to have to train yourself, So, that's what I want them to get. I want them to feel that empathy and compassion. And I also want them to get this message of radical responsibility, which you could also easily just as easily call radical empowerment. It's radical self-empowerment.
That's the word that kept coming to me as you were
Because we
talking.
can't control other people.
Right.
I may determine, even if I'm willing to say, okay, I own 30% of the responsibility for this, but by golly, it's 70% their responsibility. Well, if I really believe that and I'm unhappy about the situation, well, I just gave my power away because I can't control them. Right. I don't get to be happy or change until they change, right? The only place where we have any real influence and real power is with ourselves. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be trying to change the world, make it a better world, of course. And my work's a lot about that. But we can't do it from the place of thinking we can control the world or control others. Obviously, we cannot. But the one thing we have a lot of influence over is this. And the more we live our lives from that place of radical responsibility, then the more we are going to be a positive influence on others. And maybe we can influence some others to move in directions that would be better for them and for the world and everyone else. So, but it starts with that, for me anyway, it starts with a combination, I would say 3 core components. Somehow, at least entertaining the possibility that we have innate goodness, and then using contemplative practices to experientially discover that. 2, developing a foundation of tremendous self-compassion and self-friendship. And then 3, embracing this idea of living a choice, this idea of radical ownership.
Amazing. I'm wondering, if I recall from another interview of yours that I watched, you had talked about, I believe it was your master had kept in touch with you and was kind of your mentor while you're in prison. Is that true? You had that infrastructure. You weren't you didn't have to go it alone.
Just early on. I
Okay.
went in 85. He died in 87.
Oh my gosh.
So
Okay.
yeah, so he counseled me before I went, and we had a couple phone calls while I was in, but he died in 1987. But there were
Okay.
many people in my core community, which was the Shambhala community, um, uh, who were very supportive to me through correspondence. Some came to visit. Not like I was, I was in Springfield, Missouri, and it was like that's a very isolated. It's one of the buckles of the Bible Belt. It's not a big area for Buddhism and meditation. Um, but periodically I would get a visit. But I corresponded with a lot of people. Pema Chodron was a regular correspondent of mine,
Because you shared a
supporting
master,
with
right?
my huh?
Didn't didn't you share a master with Pemesh? I was thinking that was the same person.
Share what?
A master, the
We had the same teacher.
Rinpoche.
Yeah, we had
Right.
the same
Yes.
teacher, Trung Prumche. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I knew Pema. I knew Pema. I'd known her for a long time.
Yeah.
She's a Dharma sister. I'd known her. I've known her since the mid '70s.
Yeah.
And
Love her
anyway,
work.
yeah, we corresponded regularly, and I corresponded with a lot of people. And then somehow, just by nature of being in prison, I ended up getting in touch with lots of different spiritual communities, and I had a lot of spiritual friends and mentors. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. I think
And
Pema might have been.
later on, my teacher's son, who became the head of our lineage, came in to visit me and did
Oh,
a number of empowerments and gave practices to me. And also another lineage holder in our tradition had come in and done things for me. And then actually, after my teacher died, so I could continue my practice, one of the High Lamas of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, His Eminent Trungpa Rinpoche, came and did a series of empowerments for me. So people were very generous. And then later on, as I began studying Zen in parallel with my Tibetan path, my Zen teacher, Bernie Glassman, visited quite a few times. So, yeah.
oh, that's amazing. I think that the work of Pema, some of her books were some of the first mindfulness books that I ever was exposed to, and I really appreciate it. She was a good stepping stone from my background, and I appreciated her candor. I didn't feel like she was in some ivory tower. I felt like she was just another person who was trying to help make the world a better place, and I appreciate
Yeah,
her
she's very
spirit.
accessible. So she has this kind of way of this kind of kitchen sink level of communicating the Dharma, right? Yeah,
She does.
very
Quite a
relatable.
quite a gem. I'm wondering if you would lead us in one of your favorite mindfulness practices, as the mission of the Mindfulness Academy podcast here is to inspire our listeners by the amazing work that our guests are doing, which we are on track with that, Fleet, just in case you're wondering. And the second part is to equip our listeners with at least one mindfulness practice when they leave, because I see mindfulness, you got a tool belt, right? And I just want to keep filling the tool belt because different tools help us in different scenarios, as you well know. So I'll give you the floor.
Great. Well, I'm going to do something fairly brief, just 3 to 5 minutes here, probably. So I'll invite your audience to find their way into a posture that for each of you feels relatively uplifted, upright. I mean, if you need to do this lying down, standing up, leaning against the back of a chair for whatever reasons of physical limitation, please do whatever works for you. But if you are able to sit up in a relatively uplifted way that feels kind of naturally awake and dignified, but at the same time relaxed and stable. And then for this practice there's lots of different techniques can be done with the eyes open, gaze raised, gaze lowered, eyes closed. For this, I'd invite you to close your eyes if you're comfortable doing so. And if not, lower your gaze, maybe looking down the bridge of the nose. But if you're comfortable, I would encourage you to close your eyes because we're going to work with cultivating an embodied approach to the practice here. So having established your posture, I invite you to begin gently just bringing your attention to the body. And when I say body, I'm really talking about the actual landscape of tactile physical sensation, because body is just a word, a concept. And we actually do have a conceptual body made up of our thoughts about the body, our memories of the body, our images of the body. And our conceptual mind, as amazing as it is, it obscures the experience of direct reality. So, The invitation is here to try to tune in on some of the actual sensations, like perhaps feeling the pressure points where your body meets the chair or the cushion, where your feet meet the ground. Perhaps feeling the weight of your clothing, the texture of your clothing, or the contact between your skin and your clothing. Perhaps feeling the passage of air across the nostrils and or parted lips with each in-breath and out-breath. And then just continually extending that awareness, that curiosity all across the landscape of the body from head to toe, the external landscape to begin with, the surface of the skin, which is one vast sensory organ. And just feeling ourselves enveloped in this field of sensate experience, which is the contact between our body and the space surrounding us, which is actually tangible. It's not just empty space. And the boundary is energetic and fluid on some levels. So, but just feeling that sense of, presence and, being held within this benevolent space and feeling the physical presence of your body, at least the external presence. And if you find your mind wandering off, just gently bringing it back. We don't need to have a conversation with ourselves about that. We just come back. We just come back. And drop into deeper and deeper curiosity. Almost a passionate curiosity to really know, like, how deeply can I know myself? How deeply can I experience my own body right now? With what level of clarity, detail, vividness, depth? And then you're invited to begin exploring the internal landscape of the body, the internal landscape, the overall weight and mass of the muscles and bones, all the sensations arising and falling away with each in-breath and out-breath, the contraction, relaxation of the diaphragm muscle, the abdominal muscles, the intercostal muscles between the ribs, feeling that entire sensate flow with each in-breath and out-breath. And as much as possible, feeling it deep within the body, really being curious about feeling into the depth of the internal landscape of the body. Our entire body is a living organism. It's all sensory, all containing neuronal cells connected to the central nervous system, even the bones, the white outer hard layer of the bones, the periosteum, the marrow of the bones, all containing neuronal cells. It's all sensory. The same for the musculature, the circulatory system, all our major organs, the glands, it's all sensory. So just feeling into that, this perhaps subtler sensation within the body, but accessible nonetheless. Finding the heartbeat, the pulse, and just being curious about this internal landscape of the flow of sensate experience and energy within the body, which is awakening our capacity for what's known as interoception, a fancy word for internal perception. And we're all very familiar with that because it's how we know when we're hungry or tired, how we know when we need to use the restroom, it's how we experience discomfort and pain. But we generally ignore it unless there is some discomfort there. So the invitation here is to really drop into the body and feel into the body as deeply as we can. And just being really curious about what's there. And being willing to feel discomfort. We're pretty hardwired to chase comfort and avoid discomfort, seek pleasure, avoid pain. And that keeps us living a very unconscious mechanical life. So one of the strategies for waking up is to embrace discomfort. Now, we're not punishing ourselves. We're not looking for discomfort, but it's always present. All sensory experience arises across the spectrum from pleasant to neutral to unpleasant. So we could constantly choose to embrace the whole thing. So what am I feeling now? How deeply can I feel my own body? And again, if we find the mind wandering, we get very dispersed with our attention externally. And so we're just gathering different threads of dispersed attention and we're bringing them home to the body. And it's really a process of coming home and being in our own skin, in our own body, with feeling, with depth, with awareness, curiosity, openness. And the more deeply we're able to settle into and feel the body with curiosity and openness, we're also connecting with our emotional body because we experience emotion in the body. So we're connecting with the heart as well. And ultimately, we're connecting with the earth because the body is made of the earth, of the very same substances and minerals. So connecting with the body connects us with our heart and with the earth. And there's this vast landscape of internal somatic awareness. And it's an endless exploration. And the deeper we go into the body, we're starting with the brain. I'm talking about actual physical sensation, very tangible physical sensation. It helps developing this deeply felt presence of the body. It anchors us in nowness. And the deeper we go into the body, we're getting into the subtle sensation and really even into subtle mind eventually, the whole body mind spectrum. But the portal is the body, feeling the body. And initially, we may have a sense that we're kind of watching the body, we're observing the body, or we're even watching ourselves feel the body. And that's fine, that's part of the process. The invitation is to relax into just direct feeling without so much of a need for a feeler, for a subject-to-object relationship. We're just direct feeling. For example, the breath. I could observe my breath, or I could just feel the breath. Just feel the breath without worrying about whether there's somebody doing the feeling. And then eventually I could relax even further into just being the breath, just being the breath, just being the body. And the deeper we go into the body, we'll begin to experience a kind of resonance, kind of coherence, a kind of flow. And we'll tap into the body, mind, heart system's ability to auto-regulate into deeper and deeper attention stabilization and deeper awareness. And really dropping into the very depth of our being with pure presence, pure beingness. The body has this capacity, and we tap into it just by really gradually settling in and with feeling and curiosity of the entire totality of the body, but especially this internal sensory landscape is really the doorway into the depth. And whenever you're ready, I invite you to gradually open your eyes and reconnect with the space where you are. And just invite you to consider maybe bringing a little more of this embodied depth into your regular practice and just seeing where that takes you, seeing where it takes your practice. Thank you.
Thank you for leading us in that, Fleet. We will get here towards the end of our interview. I have so many more things I'd like to ask, but I know our time is running short here. I wanted to ask you, when folks come to work with you, what is something that they typically say? What's the pain they're experiencing?
Well, I think especially in the area of people who practice meditation, whether they're beginners, intermediate practitioners, or even advanced practitioners, we hear a lot that people discover a different dimension of the practice that they find really shifts things for them a lot. And there's their whole sense of possibility about practice altogether. And we can work with all the sense perceptions in practice. Sight, sound, smell, and taste. We can have anything can be the object of mindfulness, the object of awareness, including thoughts. Thoughts are It's actually a very deep practice to work directly with thought, but it requires a very stabilized mind already, because other thoughts are very sticky. You just get caught up, and then you're down a rabbit hole, right? But the body itself is it's the most tangible thing in our experience. And so it's a wonderful portal into the very depth of beingness, and developing this internal neurobiofeedback loop that is really already there, that the body can auto-regulate itself into profound states of awareness. And so people find that really encouraging and kind of almost revelatory, and at whatever stage of the practice they're in. It just can, they get excited about their practice again. Oh, right. To see that the possibilities of that depth that are there. So that's a lot of what we hear in terms of the practice. In terms of radical responsibility, we just hear again and again how people find that it's incredibly liberating to make that shift of focus, to really focus one choice. People find it incredibly liberating and empowering.
I like that connection with the rest of our conversation and your life's work. I'm glad to hear that. Well, tell me real quick how people can learn more about you. Where can people do that?
Well, they can go to my website, fleetmaull.com. It's a good place to start. And my podcast is there, and a lot of information. You can kind of find your way to the other work I do through there. But if people are interested in the prison work, they can go to prisonmindfulness.org or mindfulpublicsafety.org. If they're interested in our mindfulness teacher trainings, they can go to engagemindfulness.org. And if you're interested in all the online summits we do and all my online courses and neurosomatic mindfulness, radical responsibility, and all that, you can go to Heart Mind Institute, which is just heartmind.co, not .com, that's somebody else, but heartmind.co.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being on the show today. From my heart to yours, I hope you live with ease. This is your host, Amy Morgan, signing off.